Picture the city of Rome at its peak. Marble temples, glittering coins passing through countless hands, granaries overflowing with grain from Africa. Now ask yourself, if Rome was once the richest empire on earth, why do we always speak of its fall as if everything vanished overnight? In this story, we'll trace the roads that Rome's money journeyed, eastward to Byzantium, into the vaults of the church, and into the soil of rising medieval kingdoms. The wealth didn't simply disappear, it changed shape. And that's where the mystery begins. Before we start, a gentle reminder to like and subscribe. It helps Night Atlas share more stories with the world. Imagine yourself stepping into Rome on a day when the sun is steady above the city's hills. The streets stretch wide, paved in stone, lined with arches and colonnades that gleam with polished marble. Every corner carries signs of wealth. Temples rise high with walls covered in bright white surfaces, sometimes even in thin sheets of gold. Coins pass through countless hands, heavy, shining, and struck with the image of an emperor who promises order. It feels as if fortune itself has chosen this city as its home. At that moment, it seems impossible that such wealth could ever fade away. Yet the question lingers quietly. How can a place this rich, this abundant, ever truly falter? Rome's prosperity did not come from within its walls alone. Streams of goods poured into the city from distant corners of its wide territories. From the mines of Spain came a steady flow of silver, dug from the earth by countless workers, and carried to mint new coins that spread across the empire. Those coins became markers of Rome's reach, objects that paid soldiers, built bridges, and bought loyalty. Alongside silver came the deep wealth of the Nile. Egypt's fertile riverbanks grew grain in such abundance that its shipments could feed entire cities. Ships laden with wheat sailed the Mediterranean, their slow journeys ending in Rome's vast storehouses that held the food of millions. To the south, from North Africa, amphora filled with olive oil arrived daily, stacked high in the great markets. That oil lit lamps at night and flavored meals throughout the city. Together, these flows made Rome not only powerful, but visibly wealthy at every level of life. All of this movement of resources at first seemed boundless. Rome's rulers harnessed it with systems designed to keep value stable across a sprawling world. Augustus, the first emperor, helped create a coinage structure that linked regions together by trust in one currency. Gold, silver, and bronze coins worked as pieces of a larger whole, carefully set to values that could be understood in distant markets. For centuries, this system carried transactions in stable fashion, binding the West and the East within one economic order. Imagine the sense of certainty a farmer must have felt when selling grain to a merchant with coins he knew would hold their worth anywhere under Rome's standard. That unseen glue kept millions of people tethered to the empire by expectation of fairness. The wealth of the city reached every social layer, but hardly in equal measure. At the top, senators and decades-old families lived in villas whose gardens spread across acres. Marble statues decorated their halls. Bright mosaics marked the floors, telling of victories and myths. Villas stretched along the countryside, centers of farming estates managed by slaves and tenants. Meanwhile, the ordinary citizen in Rome could count on something less glamorous, but just as important. Crowds gathered in the arenas and theaters for public entertainments, the famous bread and circuses that defined life in the capital. The grain shipments from Egypt made those free distributions of bread possible, while the amphitheater, filled with spectacle, gave citizens a sense of belonging to a wealthy empire. Rome's leaders knew that sharing food and amusement tied public loyalty as strongly as new legions of soldiers could. Yet while these signs of wealth filled daily life, another thought presses in. If so much silver glittered, if the city could bathe in olive oil and grain, if villas stretched endlessly across provinces, why do we not stand among those treasures today? Why is the memory of Rome's fortune found only in scattered coins and ruined walls, rather than in the vast piles of wealth they once held? This is where the story grows less certain. A society that grows accustomed to constant streams of outside wealth may also become fragile when those streams slow. Rome's dependence on conquest and tribute built a kind of abundance that seemed eternal, but was much more fragile than marble walls suggested. The foundation of its fortune lay always on movement, grain moving, silver moving, oil moving. But if those movements shifted, the balance could quickly break. Think of how a coin feels in your hand. It is small, solid, and gives a sense of permanence. But the life of an empire cannot rest only on things solid. It rests on promises unseen. Trust that shipments will arrive, that coins will be accepted, that workers will continue to produce under command. Wealth in Rome's golden age looked permanent, yet at its heart it relied on trust and on fragile streams from faraway lands that could dry up faster than marble can erode. So even while Rome glowed with marble temples and was fed by endless caravans of goods, its dependence carried. Risk Spain's mines would not last forever. Egypt's grain shipments could be interrupted by unrest. Even olive oil shipped in jars could spoil or be stolen on the sea. Rome often looked unshakable when viewed in light reflecting from its statues. But beneath that shine, cracks in the structure were already spreading. The more the city leaned on these flows, the less it learned to stand without them. Walk again through those crowded streets in your mind. Hear merchants crying out in the forum as coins pass across stalls stacked with goods imported from far-off provinces. Watch senators leaving their grand houses in silk garments that carried whispers of trade with distant lands. See children in packed theaters eating free bread as games unfold in the arena. Every detail carries the marks of wealth, yet beneath it there is something more fragile. Dependency written into every corner. The empire's fortune was immense, but it carried weakness in its very abundance. That is the paradox of Rome at its brightest hour. The same wealth that made the city dazzling also made it vulnerable. Prosperity encouraged dependence, and dependence created cracks that no one wanted to notice. On the surface, marble and gold seemed permanent. In truth, they were only temporary shines created by streams that could falter. And they would. For even when the empire looked strongest, the first signs of strain were already rising, subtle at first, but ready to grow louder with time. Cracks beneath the shine that once split open could not be closed again. What does a civilization look like when it spends more than it earns? Picture Rome, dazzling on the surface, yet quietly building habits that could not last forever. In earlier generations, wealth seemed endless because victory on the battlefield meant treasure arriving home. But how long can a society rely on plunder to fund its life? The victories slowed, the borders held firm, and fewer spoils came back to fill the vaults. Rome had grown used to a flow of new wealth that was never meant to last beyond conquest. Without fresh lands to take, the empire began to lean unduly on what it already had, stretching those stores thinner each year. Empire and economy were locked together. One grew only as fast as the other. And when growth slowed, the balance began to tip. You can imagine the challenge. A system built on early abundance found itself faced with the daily costs of administration, garrisons, and civil projects. Once the lands were divided and secured, income from conquest dried. The empire remained just as vast, yet now with an empty pipeline of treasure. That imbalance is easy to miss when gold still circulates, when arenas are still filled with festival cheers, but beneath the noise, something uneven was stirring. If war had once built the economy, peace created debt. Rome had to live as more than a conquering power. Now it had to support, defend, and maintain not only a city, but a network of provinces spread over continents. The finances did not easily stretch to cover so great a burden. To see the imbalance more clearly, consider the army. In the Republic days, soldiers farmed land when not on campaign. But in the empire, armies became a class of professionals. Stationed at the frontiers year after year, they needed pay, food, shelter, and regular gifts to keep their loyalty. This cost did not pause. Every year, thousands of men received wages and supplies from the state, and the total swelled as legions increased. In one sense, they stood as Rome's shield. In another, they became its heaviest weight. Emperors had to find coin equal to the loyalty required, and soldiers were quick to remind emperors when payments fell short. Rule without their favor rarely lasted long. So where did such money come from? Once plunder was no longer arriving fresh? Taxes. And those taxes pressed most heavily on the small farmers and workers scattered across the provinces. Picture a farmer in Gaul or Syria facing demands not only to hand over a portion of his crop, but also to pay in cash. At first he could manage, but as assessments grew steeper, he sank under the weight. The wealthiest landowners often found ways to avoid the same burden. They pulled strings, secured exemptions, or shielded themselves with influence. The burden slid downward, pressing tightest upon those with the weakest voice. Tax collectors pushed hard, farmers resisted or fled, and productivity shrank as resentment grew. An empire cannot thrive when those feeding its system break under the pressure. Behind each coin stood a promise. It was not simply a disk of metal. It was a claim. This denarius is worth this much. For decades, that claim held steady. Trust allowed one merchant to hand over grain and another to pay in coin. But trust grew fragile. As treasury cupboards drained and taxes could not stretch further, officials turned to the money itself as the solution. Silver content in coins was gradually lowered while the stamped value remained untouched. Coins looked the same but weighed less, and the metal within rang duller. It solved little. On paper, expenses seemed covered, but in practice, the worth of the coin itself came into question. At first, most people may not have noticed. A coin felt no different at a glance. Trade continued. The surface still bore an emperor's image. But over time, merchants began to test coins more carefully. Older pieces, heavier with true silver, were hoarded away. Newer issues, thinned of precious metal, circulated less willingly. Imagine yourself in that marketplace. A farmer offers grain. A buyer extends payment with coins that gleam bright, yet the farmer squints and weighs them in his hand, suspicious of their hollow worth. Soon trust, once invisible and strong, begins to fade. A currency without trust is just stamped metal, and stamped metal alone cannot hold an empire together. This marks the moment where confidence, once taken for granted, becomes fragile. Rome's wealth had always seemed a matter of possession. Who held the silver? Who owned the land? Who had the stores of grain? Yet here was a truth both simple and profound. Wealth is not just about what is held, but what is believed. A coin is valuable only when all agree it is. That agreement gave way bit by bit as the silver content sank. It seems a small technical choice, but its effect ran deep into daily life. The lifeblood of the empire was not only soldiers or grain, it was belief in the worth of its money. When that belief cracked, the empire's veins began to weaken. This erosion of trust spread quietly. Merchants began demanding larger sums for the same goods, adjusting instinctively to the weaker coins. Soldiers, sharp-eyed as always, demanded pay in stronger currency or more of the debased kind. Emperors, desperate to secure their armies or to fund a new public spectacle, minted faster and cheaper still. It created a circle that spun only downward. Each measure added strain. Each new issue made previous value less certain. In daily trade, the change was felt most by common folk, already bent under heavy taxes. If they surrendered their crops for coins worth less each year, what hope remained for stability in their homes? By then, debasement had become a visible truth. Glass cannot be patched with paper without showing cracks. Neither can an economy built on trust survive when the tokens of trust are corrupted. It is sobering to realize that Rome did not visibly run out of money as a household might. Instead, its money ran out of credit. The numbers and the faces stamped upon coins remained, but the faith behind them had grown hollow. And so the heart of the matter comes clear. Rome's prosperity buckled not merely when silver diminished, nor when taxes grew heavy. It buckled when confidence, the unseen balance at the center of economics, wore thin. Wealth is more fragile than marble. It relies upon promises that can be withdrawn quietly, unseen until collapse appears. As coins hollowed and belief thinned, the empire's very heartbeat faltered. The sound of that faltering would echo for generations to come, carried in the lighter, duller coins that once claimed to be the foundation of the greatest city on earth. Imagine a gold coin, fresh from the mint in Rome. It carries the emperor's face, its edges sharp, its surface still shining. For a moment, it belongs to Rome, but soon it changes hands, placed into the palm of a merchant, loaded on a ship, and sent sailing into the southern seas. That coin will never return. It will vanish eastward, exchanged for silks and spices, for perfumes and delicate glass, for things Rome could not produce itself. In this way, more than marble or monuments, Rome's fortune slipped quietly away. Not stolen, not wasted, but traded into the hands of others far from the empire's borders. Trade built connections that tied the Roman world to India, Arabia, and even China. Merchants crossed deserts in long caravans, loaded not only with wool and wine, but with the glitter of metal coins that few outside would refuse. By sea, ships left the harbors of Alexandria and sailed through the Red Sea, their holds filled with gold denarii ready for transactions. Across the Indian Ocean, they reached ports where spices, pearls, and fine cloth waited. When they returned, their hulls brimmed with luxuries, but the coins themselves stayed behind in foreign markets. Picture the streets of Rome, where citizens admired silk, so soft it seemed like woven water. They lit their lamps with rare oils and scented their homes with incense carried over endless miles. None of these could be found within the empire's soil. Every ribbon of silk, every bundle of spice cost not only coin, but the slow bleed of treasure leaving Roman hands forever. The exchange dazzled those who enjoyed it, but it left fewer solid coins in circulation at home. Archaeological finds tell the quiet story left behind. In the soils of southern India, thousands of Roman gold and silver coins have been unearthed, scattered in temples and buried in hoards far from their point of origin. The imagery of emperors that few beyond the empire would ever meet still gazes from those coins. They reveal that while Rome leaned on trade to satisfy its appetite for luxuries, the price was high. Coins traveled outward, but almost none came back. Think about the nature of that imbalance. Rome was not trading metal for useful staples like grain or tools. Instead, it parted with its silver and gold for goods of pleasure, for fabrics, perfumes, and spices. These enriched daily life, but brought no return of hard value. Once money left, it did not flow back into the empire's hands. Instead, it was absorbed into marketplaces across Asia. To those regions, Rome's coins became wealth itself, melted down or reused as currency, strengthening economies far from the capital. For citizens within the empire, the result could be seen in small changes that multiplied over time. Coins lightened, circulation thinned, and confidence in the currency wavered. The marketplace still bustled, but the foundation of trust weakened. If more gold was absent, more silver reduced, how much faith could one place in the token weighed in the palm? To the everyday trader, the difference was slow but steady, a pattern that spread like a field losing soil layer by layer. This outflow of wealth was not a simple misstep of careless spending. It was the inevitable result of desire meeting availability. Asia produced silks and spices in abundance, crafts Rome could not match. The empire's elites hungered for these goods to show status and refined taste. Their appetite demanded constant flows, and with each flow, treasure drifted east. Roman rulers knew of the drain, even voiced concern, but their own households were no less eager for the same luxuries. The system fed itself, stripping the empire of hard currency while binding it to goods that could never hold the same long-lasting value. Now pause and imagine the empire's treasuries. Strong walls and locked doors protect piles of coin meant to pay soldiers, to fund public works, to respond to crisis. With each passing decade, those piles grew smaller, not because of theft or simple loss, but through trade agreed upon in open daylight. No battle was fought, no city sacked, yet the gold receded as surely as if carried off by conquerors. Wealth drained not with noise, but with silence, out of sight, borne across waters where no Roman citizen could follow. When we call gold the blood of an economy, it comes clearer here. Blood must circulate to bring life. As coins fled eastward, the empire's veins grew hollow. Currency thinned, and pulses of activity slowed. With less wealth inside to move between hands, trade within Rome's borders grew unstable. The currency could not stretch to balance the needs of a vast society. The vitality weakened, not from lack of ambition, but from too much given away to satisfy desire. And consider this as well. Asia grew stronger, where Rome grew weaker. Those coins found in India were not idle tokens. They became part of economies vibrant in their own right. Rome may have thought of itself as the center, but in this exchange, it gave more than it gained. Stability in the East became linked with weakness in the West. The story of imbalance is written plainly not in words, but in where the coins still lie today, buried in foreign earth rather than Roman vaults. There is a lesson hidden quietly in this story. Wealth can vanish without war. It can ebb away not with sudden shocks, but with choices made unthinkingly, repeated again and again. Each silk garment, each aromatic spice placed upon a noble's table, carried with it the cost of treasure gone, unlikely to return. In loving the delights of Asia, Rome fed another's strength at the expense of its own endurance. Take a moment to picture again that single gold coin, bright and new, marked with power, when it was struck. You see it sailing on a ship, traded away, and finally buried in a field thousands of miles from the capital where it was born. Multiply that one coin by thousands upon thousands, and the weight of what Rome lost comes into view. The empire exchanged its lifeblood of metal for momentary pleasures, beautiful but fleeting. This, more than cracked temples or worn roads, shows how fragility spread in Rome's foundations. It was not only neglect or corruption that weakened the empire. It was also the unseen drain, coins carried by merchants, exchanged without violence, yet leaving the empire poorer each season. The emperors may have minted more to replace what was lost, but the originals never sailed back. The treasure Rome sought to enjoy became the very path by which its fortune slipped away. And as coins grew fewer within the treasury, as people watched their trust in money evaporate, the economy hollowed like a shell. To the east, those coins belonged. To the west, only their absence was left behind. The empire bled not through sword or flame, but through trade routes that led its wealth outward. Asia kept the gold, Rome kept the silks, and though silk could shine, it could not pay soldiers or feed the provinces. Thus, the fortune of Rome, piece by piece, flowed away into distant markets. And if this fragile economy was already wearing thin, what happened when war pressed down upon it? Soon, the weight of armies and rivalry would tear it wide open. What happens when your bank must pay 100 armies at once? Imagine standing at the edge of Rome's empire. Across the long horizon, forts line the rivers, watchtowers rise over roads, and legion after legion sits waiting at the frontier. These men are not a temporary force. They are a world of full-time soldiers. At its height, Rome's military counted in the hundreds of thousands, spread along the long borders of Britain, the Rhine, the Danube, the deserts of Syria, and the sands of Africa. Each legion carried not only swords and shields, but an invisible weight, the heavy expectation of steady pay and steady rewards. A legion did not remain loyal by glory alone. It remained loyal by income that was never allowed to stop. Picture the treasury strained by this living machine. Defensive posts stretched wide and required decades of constant supply. Not a single week passed without wages owed. Soldiers expected coin, rations, clothing, and when campaigns ended, land or bonuses to secure their service. Rome's frontiers were not quiet lines, but restless zones, pushing the empire to hold firm against raids and challenges. The cost of keeping peace was, in truth, the cost of supporting a military state. The very size of this machine became a burden that outpaced the empire's ability to fund it. Emperors across generations faced the same challenge. You cannot command loyalty if your soldiers are left unpaid. Armies could declare their general emperor, shift allegiance if a rival offered higher bonuses, or even march on Rome itself when left with empty promises. To keep power, rulers had to promise more and more while their coffers drained. Gold that once built monuments now went straight into soldiers' hands. Fortresses, walls, and camps joined basilicas and amphitheaters as the projects of imperial spending, but unlike monuments, soldiers demanded constant renewal. Each month repeated the drain. Adding to this weight was a growing reliance on outsiders. As years passed, the empire filled its ranks with men recruited from tribes outside its borders. Germanic warriors, for example, were regularly invited to serve as mercenaries. They fought well, guarded borders, and filled gaps when native recruitment faltered. Yet their service was not free. They asked for higher wages or even large gifts of land. An empire that once conquered these groups now signed contracts to hire them. The cost of loyalty grew not only larger, but more complex. Rome's military now included both citizens and foreigners, each with demands that threatened to outrun the treasury's reach. To cover these shortfalls, emperors turned again to the mint. If you owe more soldiers than your coffers carry, you strike more coins. But striking more coins did not mean new silver or gold appeared. It often meant softening standards further, repeating the old habit of increasing the count of coins while lowering the precious metal inside them. What looked like payment was, in truth, more paper covering cracks in the wall. Soldiers received more pieces, but each carried less real value. They, too, noticed. The answer from an emperor was to issue yet more coins in hopes that numbers could outweigh weight. This created a cycle that slowly gnawed at stability. Payment bought soldiers' loyalty in the moment, yet that same payment eroded the economy that would be needed tomorrow. Inflation rose as coins lost substance. Prices adjusted upward as merchants demanded more denarii for the same goods. Soldiers, unwilling to lose by receiving thin coins, called for higher pay to match the rising costs. Emperors agreed and minted further rounds of coinage. Raw metal stretched thinner still. The problem that began as a necessity of loyalty now spiraled as a constant whirlpool of promises. To visualize this, imagine a soldier years into his service. He recalls when his pay bought food, wine, and clothing with ease. But with each campaign, the coins buy less. He and his comrades demand more, for without enough provisions, the army cannot eat or fight. The emperor, desperate for their allegiance, concedes. New coin floods the camp, but it holds little more real power than the last. What seemed a gift is felt as a deception, and yet soldiers are tied to their emperor by what reaches their hand. Power depends not on justice or glory, but on how many coins an emperor can hand out at the right time. This was the contradiction at the heart of Rome's military weight. The army was the empire's shield, yet also its hungriest mouth. Weak rulers who failed to feed it lost their thrones. Strong rulers who managed to pay it drained their treasuries dry. The armies secured Rome's provinces, but devoured the wealth those provinces produced. The sword that defended Rome also cut into its survival, line by line, coin by coin. The long-term effect was a kind of exhaustion. Wealth that had once been scattered across the empire's wide economic base now narrowed toward a single end, buying peace with soldiers. Instead of strengthening the whole, resources clotted around the army. Other corners of society, roads, aqueducts, baths, education, saw the neglect that followed when all energy bent toward the frontier lines. The brilliance of Rome's lifestyle dimmed, not from sudden ruin, but from the subtle bleed of constant military expense. This imbalance was fragile even without crisis. Add wars of succession, raids, and uprisings on the borders, and it reached breaking points with alarming speed. Each new emperor arrived with the same challenge: pay the armies first or risk being overthrown. This meant new coin presses hammered day and night. Each press gave the soldiers what they wanted short term, but hollowed out the economy each year that passed. So we reach a sobering realization. The very instrument of Rome's survival, the legions that stretched order across continents, was woven into the seeds of its decline. The empire's strongest sword was also its deepest debt, a force unmatched on ancient battlefields, yet one whose hunger forced the state into reckless cycles of inflation and dependence. Each shield raised on the frontier bore a hidden cost, carried not only by the treasury, but by every citizen who faced higher taxes and weaker coin. Picture again that bank tasked with paying 100 armies at once. It could never rest. It could only pull coins out faster, thinning the silver, reshaping promises, draining wealth down to nothing. There is no gentle way for such a balance to last, and soon the strain would grow beyond control. The weight grew heavier still, until the strain burst into what history remembers as the Great Crisis. The empire's imbalance was no longer quiet or hidden. It would now stand in the open, ablaze for all to see. Imagine picking up a coin from your pocket and sensing that it feels different than before. You remember its weight, the sound it once made when struck against another, the way it gleamed in sunlight. Now, as you roll it across your fingers, it feels lighter, duller, almost fragile in its worth. Year after year, this transformation continues so slowly that it could almost pass unnoticed, yet plainly enough that trust in the coin begins to slip. In the 3rd century of Rome, this was not imagination. It was daily life. People held coins that no longer carried the strength of silver they once promised. Each piece seemed a little more like painted metal than real wealth, and confidence in the money that bound the empire together began to erode. The 3rd century crisis has been remembered for invasions, plagues, and endless rivalries between emperors. But at its quiet center was the story of a currency in steady decline. On the surface, coins still looked the same, carrying emperors' faces and familiar designs, but the reality beneath those marks told another tale. The denarius, once a trusted measure of value, had been thinned of precious silver until it was mostly base metal. Successive rulers, anxious to promise their armies more pay than treasuries could support, turned again and again to debasement. Coins increased in number, but their worth grew lighter. It was like filling a jar with water that has been slowly mixed with ash. The jar may appear full, yet its purity is lost. In marketplaces across the empire, the effects stirred visibly. A loaf of bread demanded more coins than it had the year before. Farmers began to resist payment delivered in the latest issues, preferring instead the older forms still rich with silver. Hoarding of earlier coins became common. People recognized that yesterday's money was stronger than today's, and so they stored them away, leaving only the thinner, shakier pieces in active trade. This created a loop of instability. The best coins disappeared into hidden jars buried beneath floors or stowed in walls, while the worst coins passed constantly from hand to hand. Transactions became less about value and more about suspicion, as trust waned with every trade. One symbol of this decline was the Antoninianus, introduced in the 3rd century and declared to hold greater value than the denarius. Named for an emperor who hoped to reform the system, it looked bold, larger in size, and bore fresh designs meant to assure the public of its worth. In truth, however, its silver content was even weaker. What was announced as worth 2 denarii quickly fell in market reality to hardly more than one, and citizens saw through the illusion. The coin itself became evidence of the growing distance between official claims and economic truth. This deception did not remain confined to coins. It spread into every corner of commerce. Merchants raised prices to guard against loss, demanding greater sums of weaker money for the same bundle of grain or cloth. Soldiers, aware that pay shrank in real terms, called for more of the new coins just to maintain their standard of living. Emperors agreed, minting at increased speeds to satisfy demands. But each new flood of weak currency worsened the cycle, chasing former value that could never be recaptured. What began as a practical solution to lacking treasury resources became a spiral with no clear escape. The connection between money and trust may feel subtle, but in Rome it was felt deeply by both ordinary and powerful alike. For a rural farmer, trust meant believing that the coins offered for his wheat would buy him the tools or goods he needed in turn. For a soldier, trust meant believing that his pay could be exchanged for clothing or food while guarding the cold frontiers. When trust broke, daily life itself broke. Negotiations became tense, taxes less reliable, and markets unstable. The empire's heartbeat faltered not at its borders first, but inside its lifeblood of trade. Imagine yourself in a Roman marketplace during this period. The stalls are there as always, displaying olives, pottery, and cloth. But instead of quick exchanges, buyers press coins into hands with hesitation. Sellers weigh and test them, listening for the pitch of the ring and examining their surfaces in the light. Whispers circulate about which coins to accept and which to refuse. Hordes of heavy older silver vanish deeper into storage, leaving circulation thinner and weaker by the month. To live in that time was to live surrounded by gradual mistrust, knowing that the very symbol meant to unify trade had become fragile. This lack of confidence did more than hurt daily purchases. It struck against the ability of emperors to rule. New claimants seized power during the crisis, and often their very first act was to promise the army large sums. To fund these gifts, they struck new issues of coinage, flooding the economy with hollow metal while devaluing what still remained. Soldiers were momentarily satisfied, but in the long term, the empire's foundation grew weaker. Rulers could not sustain loyalty without undermining the economy meant to feed their people. Each year saw more rulers and more coins, each slightly worse than the last, creating a sense that nothing was stable, neither throne nor currency. For those watching it unfold, the change must have felt strange, like living in a world where numbers increased, yet meaning shrank. Purses looked full but bought less. Official proclamations boasted reform, but marketplaces whispered of emptiness. The empire, rich in land and people, was unable to rely on the very money that tied those pieces together. A civilization once confident in marble, law, and order now could not trust the coin sitting in its citizens' hands. There is something haunting in recognizing how quietly such decline works. Armies may clash with noise, cities may burn in smoke, yet the deeper wound often lies in the silent shift of trust. Rome's collapse of currency was not only the story of silver lost, but of faith leaving with it. When citizens no longer trusted that their money mattered, the empire lost its heartbeat. So as coins grew lighter and duller, the empire itself seemed lighter too, its strength hollowed from within. A world once bound by shared currency and confidence was left searching for stability. Yet in that uncertainty, a few leaders would still rise, convinced that broken trust could be patched, that systems could be rebuilt. Their attempts did not come without cost, but they reveal how far Rome was willing to go to restore the sense of value that once carried its strength. And so, amidst collapse, new emperors prepared to step forward, not with swords alone, but with fresh coins, fresh reform, and promises that wealth could indeed be trusted again. Is it possible for a single leader to mend the cracks of an entire empire's trust? Imagine standing in Rome at a time when coins felt hollow, armies demanded more, and borders seemed fragile. Into this chaos stepped emperors who carried visions of repair. Aurelian, first among them, did not only wear the burden of a sword. He carried with him the hope of restoring meaning to money and the stability of Rome's shaken ground. His task was enormous: to give back to the people and the soldiers a sense of certainty when certainty had been slipping away for generations. Aurelian began with the basics. The coinage system had drifted into dishonor, flooded by issues that people increasingly refused to take at face value. He attempted to produce pieces that held genuine weight and could inspire new confidence. Though not completely free of debasement, his coinage marked an effort to bring standards closer to honesty. Currency, once drained of trust, could not be fixed overnight, but Aurelian's attempt to reintroduce stronger issues was like a steady hand extended to calm a restless crowd. At the same time, he pushed campaigns outward, reclaiming territories that had broken away during the empire's crisis years. With borders restored and coins gradually improved, he hoped the entire body of Rome would believe once more in its resilience. Picture Rome in this moment. The capital, once drowning in loss, now saw a leader pointing to real achievements. Provinces like Gaul, once cut off, were pulled back under imperial order. The eastern provinces, too, were reintegrated. Aurelian's victories restored not only land, but a sense of coherence. The empire that many feared was fading had, for a moment, regained its outline. And with each frontier secured, so too did the weight of his coin designs gain small credibility. When the empire seemed whole again, the coin bearing its name appeared less empty. Yet even as Aurelian worked, his reforms revealed limits. Silver could not be conjured from promises, nor could trust be rebuilt simply by stamping out fresh coins. His actions demonstrated that leadership matters in moments of fracture, but also that even strong rulers face restraints sharper than swords. His coinage remained modestly debased, not matching the richness of earlier centuries. His successes slowed the fall, but they could not erase the deeper fractures. After his death, others inherited both his gains and the same endless economic challenge. Then came Diocletian, a ruler of broader ambition, who believed that the empire could be saved through structure more rigid than ever before. Where Aurelian sought balance between trust and power, Diocletian sought control, woven through every aspect of Roman life. His answer was not tentative, but sweeping. He reorganized provinces, expanded bureaucracy, and most importantly, attempted to cage the economy itself within rules. Imagine yourself in the daily marketplace when Diocletian's reforms reached their height. An edict set the price of bread, the cost of cloth, the wages of laborers, and the rate of essential goods. It was an attempt to freeze a restless world in place. Prices that had soared with debased currency were suddenly constrained by law. Merchants were ordered to sell at these limits, buyers instructed not to pay beyond them. The empire had become not only a military machine, but a regulated market, watched by officials who carried the emperor's will. To enforce stability, he also expanded minting systems, creating regional centers across the empire to standardize coinage. No longer would Rome alone decide. Instead, local mints produced coins meant to bind their regions to the imperial standard. Taxes became stricter, collected more evenly, and demanded with urgency. Wage controls were imposed, limiting what laborers could earn while attempting to keep production viable. In theory, this meant that soldiers could be ensured steady pay, peasants could rely on fixed costs for grain, and inflation would pause in its climb. But reality moved against these grand visions. Prices fixed by command rarely reflect true markets. When the cost of grain was set too low, farmers hesitated to bring their crops, fearing they would lose instead of gain. Shortages followed. When wages were restricted, workers resisted and production thinned. In many towns, barter returned as people preferred to exchange directly rather than risk engaging with bound coinage or forbidden prices. What had been designed to secure stability instead encouraged quiet retreat from the official system. Beneath an edict meant to solve inflation, new forms of economic life sprouted in shadows, less visible but more real. The empire now lived in two halves. On one side was the official system with its imperial coins, fixed prices, and taxes assessed with strictness. On the other side was the practical life of people who avoided full participation, trading directly, hoarding, or shifting possessions out of reach of collectors. Diocletian's reforms created order on paper, but often deepened confusion on the ground. A farmer might conceal produce to avoid surrendering it at a fixed low price. A carpenter might take payments in goods rather than controlled wages. The system that was supposed to restore certainty instead drove citizens to seek certainty outside its boundaries. For Diocletian, the reforms were not only economic, but part of a vision of stronger imperial control. To tie people more closely to the land and professions, he pressed social divisions into permanence. Sons of soldiers would remain soldiers, sons of farmers tied to fields, sons of craftsmen locked into trades. This attempt at order reflected a fear of collapse, yet it also dulled mobility and placed heavy chains upon the population. The empire survived, but at the cost of rigidity that sapped its flexibility. Take a moment to see the paradox. Aurelian and Diocletian both saw clearly that without stable money and reliable revenues, the empire could not endure. Both worked toward stability with determination. Yet their cures sometimes carried their own illnesses. Aurelian's stronger coins did not restore full confidence. Diocletian's regulations created shortages instead of plenty. Leaders who tried to save wealth often discovered that their very measures hastened its decline. Still, both efforts matter in the story of Rome because they show that the empire was not blind, nor were its rulers complacent. They perceived the wounds and sought to heal them, though the remedies fell short. What their struggles reveal is that trust, once broken, is far harder to recover than to keep. You cannot simply instruct citizens to believe in coins again, nor can you legislate prices into honesty. Value arises from trust, and once value is hollowed, even the strongest emperor's voice is not enough to fill it. This brings us to a final turning point. After Aurelian's careful steps and Diocletian's firm hand, another emperor would rise with a different vision. His choice was not to rely on silver stretched thin or rules imposed by edict. Instead, he would introduce something that changed the very base of Rome's currency, a new foundation that would hold not for years, but for centuries. One final emperor charted a path that carried lasting results. What if stability could be imagined not in silver, but instead in gold? Imagine the halls of an empire tired from years of hollow coins, each new issue thinner than the last. In that world of mistrust, a single decision could change the foundation of daily exchange. When Constantine introduced the solidus, he offered not a patchwork fix, but a new anchor. This coin was not born in weakness. It was forged in strong gold, carefully measured and kept steady. It was smaller than many coins before it, yet it held a certainty that others could not match. For centuries it became not only the coin of trade, but a symbol of endurance. With the solidus, a weary empire touched once again on the power of trust. Picture the new coin in hand. It was golden, about the size of a fingertip, pressed with the face of the emperor. Unlike the silver denarii that had fallen from grace, this piece held its weight honestly. Merchants could measure it against scales and find its claim to value real. There was no hidden dilution. The government committed to maintaining its standard. The solidus became a vessel of confidence, strong enough to travel markets, strong enough to carry wealth across years and across lands. It was not just another coin. It was a new beginning for an empire still staggering from years of unrest. Why did it matter so deeply? People had grown weary of coins that shifted like sand. To trust a piece of money is to trust unseen voices who promise that it carries value. That trust had been broken in the years before. With the solidus, that faith was rewoven. It was not only an economic move, but a gesture of healing in the relationship between ruler and subject. Those who bought, traded, or saved could now believe again that what they held today would mean something tomorrow. The strength of that decision endured beyond Constantine himself, lasting into the empires that rose in his shadow. The design created a golden chain of stability that spanned centuries, far outliving the silver coins that had failed. Yet the choice to build on gold did more than soothe trade. It shifted the weight of power itself. Though all of Rome shared this coin, its strongest impact gathered in the East. Here wealth flowed steadily. Here Constantine planted the foundation of his future, and here the city of Byzantium rose as a second heart. When he moved his capital there, later calling it Constantinople, he joined the steadiness of money to the strength of place. The solidus and the city belonged to one another. Together they stood not as old Rome repeating itself, but as a new Rome rising. Picture Byzantium becoming the center. It sat on the Bosporus, a narrow line between continents, surrounded by sea routes thick with trade. Ships from the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and the East converged at its harbors. Imagine traders arriving with grain, silk, and spices, their hands full of goods and gold coins to use along the way. In Constantinople, the solidus found its perfect stage. The coin that carried stability met the city that gathered wealth, and together they flourished. This reshaped the empire's balance, giving the East a growing advantage. Over time, the East stood strong precisely because it carried the solidus as its anchor. In the West, conditions remained harsher. Old networks weakened. The economy struggled to hold steady under pressure, and coins there never found the same strength. The contrast grew clear. One part of Rome built upon gold and trust, the other upon strained traditions without the same lifeline. This new reality widened the division between East and West. Though they shared history, their futures parted. The East could thrive, its solidus firm, its trade strong. The West, with thinner reserves and a weaker foundation, stumbled toward decline. What does this remind us of? Wealth does not vanish. It shifts. Rome's fortunes had seemed scattered, lost, drained in the years before Constantine. But in the golden solidus, wealth found a new path. It did not disappear with the fading of silver. It moved eastward with the capital. It pooled in Constantine's new city. The East would take that inheritance, shaping it into centuries of Byzantine strength, while the West carried forward on a road that crumbled. Let's pause here with the coin itself. Imagine running your fingers across its surface now, 19 centuries later. The face of Constantine still looks back. The gold has not tarnished. The weight has not lessened. It has survived longer than the throne of Rome itself. Few objects in history carry such direct continuity. Where marble crumbles and buildings fall to dust, the solidus remains. It stands as proof that sometimes a single decision, carefully measured, can shape the future beyond one ruler or one empire. In the marketplaces of Constantinople, the coin opened flows of activity. Merchants trusted it, foreign rulers respected it, and trade networks relied upon it. Across deserts and seas, the solidus circulated as the heartbeat of exchange. In distant lands, kings and traders accepted it because they knew it held its weight. Trust extended its reach farther than any army could march. So when people say that the East survived while the West unraveled, part of that survival rests in small round coins of gold kept steady for generations. Constantine did not only move his throne, he moved the empire's lifeblood. The decision carried both promise and division. In the East, prosperity spread, halls rose in brilliance, commerce thrived. In the West, stretched thin, wealth became scarce, and power grew fragile. It was as if the empire split not only in government, but in economy, two halves living side by side with very different fates. The new golden foundation showed that wealth had not been lost as much as redirected, choosing one shore over another, and so the story of money and trust turned once more. The empire found a coin that endured, and in its endurance, the East discovered a path of strength. Step back again and think of Rome in those earlier centuries, weighed down by hollow denarii, consumed by inflation. Now contrast that with the solidus, steady, bright, accepted everywhere within the empire and far beyond. The arc bends from hollow metal to solid gold, from weakness to stability, from fracture to continuity. The lesson is quiet but firm. Value lies not only in the presence of wealth, but in choosing the form that can guard it over time. Constantine's solidus whispers this across history. It tells us that true wealth is not only gathered, it is preserved through strength of trust and durability of form. From this moment onward, Rome's story grew two voices. In the East, a steady tone that carried on through centuries. In the West, a faltering rhythm, strained and worn. Wealth had not vanished. It had chosen its ground. And from here, Rome was no longer whole. The East steady, the West unraveling, and the empire forever divided. When Rome was sacked, where did its treasures go? Imagine the marble city, long seen as the heart of the empire, suddenly laid open to those it once fought to keep at bay. The shock was not only in the violence of soldiers entering its gates, but in what they carried away. Coins, jewels, sculptures, and even sacred relics were gathered in heaps, carted off like harvest from fertile fields. It was wealth not spent, not traded, but taken. And through this taking, Rome's fortune fractured in ways it could never wholly repair. The year 410 marked the first time in many centuries that foreign hands had broken through the walls of Rome itself. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, entered a city already weakened by famine and political divisions. They found not an indestructible capital, but a place still filled with gold and art, vestiges of its long control over the Mediterranean world. In their march, they gathered what they could. From mansions, temples, and storerooms came treasures once displayed as proof of Rome's power. Precious metals were melted down, religious items seized, and villas stripped bare. In the silence that followed, the city realized not only that its walls had failed, but that centuries of value had been emptied in only a few days. It is important to pause and picture what this meant for ordinary eyes. Imagine waking to find temple doors broken, statues missing from pedestals, and coins stripped from altars where offerings once stood. For Romans, wealth had been tied to presence, to shine, to marble, to goods surrounding them in daily life. In a single sack, much of that presence was torn away. This was not the slow bleed of treasure through trade eastward as before, but the brutal and sudden drain of violence. Wealth was not transformed by markets, it was carted off by force. Yet the story did not end there. Only 45 years later, Rome was struck again. In 455, the Vandals entered the city and looted with a thoroughness that still lingers in memory today. The image of their sack became so fixed in culture that the word vandalism carries their name. For 2 full weeks, they stripped Rome of valuables. What could be melted was melted. What could be carried was loaded onto ships. Wealth that had once seemed eternal in the capital now sailed south across the Mediterranean to Carthage, where it fed the Vandals' strength. Imagine treasures crafted to honor emperors now sitting in foreign vaults, their makers long dead, their meaning reshaped. The same marble and gold once used to glorify Rome became fuel for its conquerors' wealth. Many shipments, however, never reached their destinations. Ships heavy with plunder sank in storms or wrecks, scattering artifacts across sea floors where some remain hidden. In this way, Rome's treasure was not solely looted or absorbed elsewhere, but sometimes swallowed by the sea itself. Gold coins, silver vessels, and finely wrought jewelry lay buried for centuries, not enriching those who stole them, nor those who once owned them. Some were rediscovered in later times, but for much of history, they were simply gone, lost chapters of fortune lying mute in saltwater silence. Consider also what happened to objects too tied to daily use to remain intact. A golden chalice displayed in a temple could be melted down into raw material, shaped instead into brooches or jewelry by the very tribes who looted it. In this transformation, wealth did not vanish, it shifted form. Yet each shift carried it further from Rome's identity. Tribes who once lived on the edges of Roman life now wore fragments of its fortune on their bodies. Each ring or necklace was an echo of Rome's riches, stripped from the empire's symbolic core and absorbed into personal ornamentation. To Romans who saw only absence, these transformations must have felt like a kind of vanishing, even if the material had not truly disappeared. The contrast between wealth as Rome had displayed it and wealth as it now existed could not have been sharper. Where once treasure was housed in marble temples or state vaults, Now it was hidden in tribal hordes, carried to foreign cities, or lost beneath waves. The grandeur of central Rome gave way to the scattering of fortunes in distant places. What had once been unified became fragmented, each fragment carrying a story, but never again joining into a whole. Archaeological discoveries allow us to glimpse pieces of this dispersal. Bronze statues broken apart, coin hoards buried far from Rome, golden ornaments styled in non-Roman designs. All these remnants speak of how far and wide the fortune spread. The very act of melting and remaking shows how conquest reshaped wealth into symbols that no longer carried imperial power. They became tokens of new rulers and new identities. For the people of Rome, each sack was more than a material loss. It was a shattering of memory. To see sanctuaries emptied, houses stripped, and treasures shipped away was to live through the visible removal of the city's ancient pride. Once the heart of empire, the city became instead a place of absence, its riches recorded only in memory or rumor. Rome, which had once been the collector of spoils from 1,000 conquests, now suffered the same fate it had long inflicted upon others. This scattering proved irreversible. Unlike trade routes, which could in theory be balanced by new exchanges, the spoils of conquest moved in only one direction. The Visigothic plunder of 410 did not return. The Vandal shipments of 455 did not sail back across the Mediterranean. Even when treasures eventually changed hands again through war or trade, they were never restored to their original form or setting. They became absorbed into new contexts, reshaped, melted, or forgotten. The physical fortune that once defined the empire no longer belonged to it. As we picture this loss, we see that Rome did not simply decline in abstract ways. Its wealth, real and tangible, was fractured into pieces that vanished into the sea, into workshops, and into vaults far from the Tiber. What once shone across a marble city became scattered across lands and waters, much of it irretrievable. To trace the fate of Rome's money during this period is to follow a trail of fragments rather than a single flowing river. And yet, not all treasure was destroyed or absorbed into foreign hands. Some forms of wealth did not scatter with armies. They gathered into other rising institutions, preserved in sanctuaries, churches, and networks of continuity. Even as marble crumbled and ships carried gold away, there were places where fortune did not vanish, but settled into a new kind of order. The sackings reveal the fracture, but the next chapter reveals how fragments could yet become foundations. Where marble gods once stood, bishops now ruled, and wealth followed. Imagine stepping into a Roman temple, its columns tall, and its altars once heavy with offerings to Jupiter or Mars. Now the statues are gone, replaced by the steady presence of the Christian cross. Where incense once honored old gods, candles flicker before saints. Across this shift in worship, wealth too quietly shifted its home. Treasures that had once flowed into public shrines now passed into the hands of churches. In uncertain years when cities were looted and emperors came and went, the church remained. It offered order where the empire's power had faltered, and for many, placing wealth in its care felt safer than trusting it to governments that failed to last. This trust made the church a growing steward of land, money, and objects of value. Families who had long feared the decline of the empire began to donate property. By doing so, they not only supported sacred institutions, but also secured prayers for their souls and public memory that could outlast civil disruption. Emperors themselves recognized the church's rising influence. Those who ruled during the fading centuries of Rome gave gifts of both land and gold, seeing in the Christian faith a power that could hold society together longer than their earthly rule. In this slow widening river of donations, the church became a new reservoir for the wealth of Rome. Picture some of this wealth as you might see it then. Basilica walls rising with stone and marble, funded by gifts and endowments. The basilicas were vast, their spaces designed to draw eyes upward toward heavens. They became Rome's most impressive new structures when many old temples fell into ruin. The interiors carried not just words of Scripture, but gleaming decoration. Precious metals shaped chalices, altarpieces, and reliquaries that guarded fragments of saints. Gold, silver, and gem-covered boxes glimmered in candlelight. Where emperors had once stamped coins with their image, now sacred relics bore the weight of devotion, richly encased for both ritual and display. We can imagine the impact this had on minds at the time. In a period when trust in coinage had worn thin, a reliquary covered in gold carried a different kind of assurance. It represented stability not born of economy, but of faith. To contribute wealth to the church was to tie fortunes to something thought eternal, something that survived the fall of emperors and the plunder of enemies. For many citizens, this seemed a safer investment. The altar did not shift in loyalty as armies did. The bishop remained when politicians faltered. The church also gained strength through land. Across provinces once managed by civil officials, large estates began to migrate into clerical hands. These properties fed monasteries, funded clergy, and sheltered communities. Fields once supporting a senator's villa now supported a bishop's diocese. As centuries passed, the church's landholdings grew into one of the widest networks of resources in Europe. This was not just wealth in coin or objects that could be looted again by invaders, but land that yielded grain each season, sustaining its holders with stability that cities could no longer guarantee alone. Imagine a family in a provincial town faced by unrest and raids. To donate land to the church meant more than charity. It meant protection. The church could offer safety by associating land with sacred purpose, discouraging violent seizure. It could also ensure that crops supported local relief, giving donors honor in both life and memory. In this sense, gold and land given to the church became not loss, but transformation. Families exchanged earthly property for eternal prayers, and in doing so, poured material wealth into spiritual form. As power gathered in the church, it began to stand not just beside the state, but often above it. A bishop could command more wealth in his city than a secular official. Churches became centers of redistribution. They fed the poor during famine, offered refuge in times of war, and built structures that still stand in memory today. Their wealth, unlike that of many senators or emperors, endured through institutions. This gave the church visibility in daily life that neither emperors nor fading aristocrats could match. Consider also the symbolism at play. Where emperors once held public games to tie citizens to the empire, the church built festivals honoring saints funded by collected wealth. Instead of circuses, there were processions. Instead of bread handed by officials, there was almsgiving by parishes. The same principle, using wealth to stabilize loyalty, shifted from political to spiritual leaders. And because people believed the church represented divine permanence, the loyalty it bought proved harder to shake. Reliquaries especially show how imperial wealth transformed. Crafted from the same gold and silver that once struck imperial coins or dressed villas, these containers became focal points for pilgrimages. People traveled long distances to pray before relics dressed in precious casing. The act of enshrining holiness inside earthly treasure made the wealth itself part of ritual. Gold that once bore an emperor's profile now encased the memory of saints. This change redirected wealth into symbols of faith, tying fortunes to eternity instead of to fading rulers. By the time Rome's political center collapsed in the West, the church stood with enough wealth to act as both spiritual guide and economic anchor. It could support armies, negotiate with kings, and provide charity, all through resources gathered from imperial leftovers and eager donors. Wealth that might have vanished into looters or traders instead circulated into altars, basilicas, and libraries. In this way, the church did not simply preserve fortunes. It amplified them into influence. The story of shifting wealth shows us how fortune survived even when empires crumbled. Rome's coins, stripped of silver, had faltered. Its armies, heavy with cost, had drained the treasury. Its treasures, carried away by invaders, had scattered. Yet within churches, gold still gleamed, fields still yielded, and trust still flowed. The church turned fragile wealth into stability. It adopted and reshaped it, weaving fortune into structures that endured through the medieval age. Take a moment to picture that change. Where once Rome's riches funded arenas and triumphal arches, now they fed the building of cathedrals. Instead of statues cut for emperors, there stood altars dressed in silver and iconography, shining in candlelight. Instead of wealth, meant only to dazzle power, there was wealth tied to both worship and charity. In this form, the riches of Rome did not fade. They simply changed guardians and purposes. And so, in the centuries after Rome's political collapse, it was the church that held together not only faith, but fortune. Its gold and land, its basilicas and reliquaries became new vessels of power. Through them, the inheritance of empire was reframed as a sacred trust. This wealth did not vanish in the collapse. It settled into new hands where it would help shape the kingdoms of medieval Europe. The fall of Rome scattered fortune in many directions, but one stream gathered most strongly here, in the steady arms of the church, still holding light where the empire's flame had gone out. How did barbarian kings and medieval lords inherit the wealth of Rome? Imagine the empire in its last days, stretched thin, its old systems weakened but not erased. Roads still cut across the landscape, aqueducts still carried water, villas still rose in the countryside. The conquerors who entered Roman lands did not begin on bare ground. They stood among ruins that still carried the echo of gold, law, and order. Step by step, they began to take that inheritance into their own hands, shaping it into something both familiar and new. Germanic rulers were quick to adopt much of Rome's framework. They wore Roman-style garments, issued proclamations in Latin, and even relied on Roman scribes to set their laws into writing. Where once an emperor had been the source of authority, now it was a king of Gothic or Frankish blood who used the language of Rome to strengthen his claim. This borrowing gave the new rulers weight in the eyes of Roman populations still living under their control. It signaled continuity, a promise that life under the newcomers would not be cut free from all the structures people already knew. Coins provide another quiet record of this change. In the West, the golden solidus remained so trusted that many of the so-called barbarian kings continued to issue coins modeled directly upon it. Some even copied the emperor's image, keeping the familiar style to assure their subjects of continuity and value. Sometimes the name shifted. Sometimes the markings betrayed a local twist, but the form remained Roman. These coins passed back and forth in small markets and across borders, carrying Rome's old image into a new world. Repurposed and restamped, they tethered the memory of empire to emerging kingdoms. The transformation can also be seen in the landscapes of the countryside. The grand villas that once marked the wealth of senators and imperial officials slowly became seats of local lords. Picture a vast country house, walls decorated with fading mosaics, once surrounded by slaves and tenants supplying grain for Rome. In time, these villas became the cores of medieval estates. A house that had been Roman in style and wealth was now a castle or fortress, tied no longer to a vast empire, but to a single family. The stones of empire became the roots of feudalism, holding fragments of wealth in a much smaller circle of power. This shift meant that fortunes, which had once been tied to Rome's great treasury, now became tied to local control. Instead of wealth pooled into the hands of emperors, it was spread into the arms of rising lords. Castles replaced central palaces as the visible shelters of power. Coins continued to circulate, fields continued to produce, but the direction of wealth had changed. Power lay no longer in the wide span of a Mediterranean empire, but in clustered realms, each with its own authority. From Spain to Gaul to Italy, fragments of old estates marked the survival of Roman fortune, reshaped into smaller sovereignties. Language also carried Rome's inheritance. These new rulers relied on Latin, not only in coin inscriptions, but in law codes, charters, and church records. Law itself became the bridge between ancient and medieval. Kings such as the Visigoths or Burgundians recorded their customs in written codes shaped by Roman models. This did not mean they copied laws word for word. They mixed Roman practice with their own traditions. But the presence of Latin writing gave their rules legitimacy, and through it, the wealth of Rome's legal mind survived. Consider daily life during this transformation. A farmer might still work the same fields his grandfather did under an imperial governor, but now he gave part of his crop to a local lord who lived in the old villa nearby. Taxes became dues, and the collector was no longer an imperial officer, but a baron's steward. The coins in circulation resembled the old ones, though sometimes thinner, and the language of official rules still read in Latin. To the farmer, life may have felt continuous in many ways, though narrower in scope. The wealth of empire had not disappeared, but had become local, drawn inward toward the nearest castle. This was not only decline. The shrinking of wealth into corners also meant it could be protected. A Roman treasury might be emptied by an invasion, but a hidden hoard in a castle vault could survive. In this sense, fragmentation made fortune less vulnerable to single disasters. Each kingdom carried its own store, and although poorer by comparison to the vast empire, these stores endured. Small streams of wealth, protected in local strongholds, replaced the wide rivers of fortune that once flowed through Rome. Think of Roman coins discovered centuries later, buried in small hoards across Europe. Many were hidden during this period of transition, kept as safe deposits beneath fields or within walls. Some were later melted, others copied, others passed hand to hand until they wore smooth. Each coin tells of continuity, of wealth that still mattered even after the empire's fall. They show us the material thread linking empire to kingdom, proof that value survived, reshaped in smaller circles. The church, too, linked into this transformation. Many barbarian rulers tied themselves to bishops as partners in governing. By aligning with the church, they inherited not only sacred authority, but access to its wealth of land and treasure. A crown placed upon a king's head by a bishop gave legitimacy, while ties to monasteries created stability. In this alliance, the old Roman fortune tucked into basilicas now became intertwined with the fortunes of kings. The church's holdings, once imperial gifts, stood now as part of a broader network of medieval wealth. Over time, the memory of Rome itself became part of the wealth rulers claimed. Kings styled themselves as heirs to Roman legacy. Whether or not their bloodlines carried any link, even as coins grew simpler and castles replaced basilicas as the heart of local authority, invoking Rome lent a sense of permanence. To say a rule was tied to Rome was to call upon the shadow of history's greatest empire, borrowing not only its laws and structures, but its very prestige. Cultural memory itself became a form of inherited treasure. The shift from empire to kingdom did not erase fortune. Instead, it restructured it, breaking the vast into the small, the general into the local. The olive oil shipped across the Mediterranean became grain tied to a single estate. The coins once stamped by emperors became coins marked by kings. Laws once pronounced in the Senate now echoed in charters of lords. Every detail was narrower, but what remained was more durable against broad collapse, and this is perhaps the quiet truth at the heart of the change. Wealth that once dazzled at a scale too vast to sustain found endurance in smaller fragments. The empire's end was not the end of value. It was its shrinking into forms that could last through the difficulties of the early medieval world. Families gathered it, kings shielded it, lords defended it. What began in marble halls and imperial treasuries was scattered into farms, castles, and monasteries where it rested and renewed itself in new forms. So when we ask where Rome's money went, the answer here is not disappearance. It turned into castles of stone, into coins worn by time, into written laws preserved in Latin script, into lands tied to feudal bonds. The fortune had become local, no longer vast imperial, but strong in smaller roots. This was the way wealth endured, not as a shining empire, but as the foundation of kingdoms that shaped Europe's next age. The story, in the end, is one not of loss, but of transformation. Wealth does not vanish. It transforms, carrying its meaning into new shapes with each generation. The riches of Rome did not dissolve into nothingness. They crossed into Byzantium, forming a core of stability built upon Constantine's golden coin. They gathered into the church, where land, relics, and offerings turned into enduring authority. They spread across Europe's fields and castles, guiding law, loyalty, and custom. Picture this. The coins may be gone from Rome's streets, but their legacy still breathes in the institutions, beliefs, and designs we recognize today. What remains is not metal, but the quiet frameworks that still shape our world.